Is Matthew Guy making some, having an effect, and is Dan still a shoo-in to win?
Look, I've never said that Dan is a shoo-in. I've always said that anything can happen. I've said that Dan will probably win, and I still suspect he will. But again, the number one thing I'm asked by people on the street or on air and all sorts of other things is, will Dan really win? And I say, probably. But again, as I've said on your show before, nobody expected Jeff to lose in 1999. Nobody expected Ted to win in 2010. In both cases, the incumbent leaders were seen as arrogant, out of touch. They'd been there too long. In the case of Jeff Kennett, unfairly, in my view, there were allegations of impropriety in office and so on. And I think, similar to 1999, we're going to see some seats change hands that people have not factored in and aren't paying attention to at all. In regional Victoria, we may see a number of seats flip because they got it pretty tough during COVID lockdowns. They were not the laptop class in the main in these areas. They got locked down despite most of the cases, the fact that most of the cases were in the city. And also, I think we might see a few competitive, what I call maroon independents in the outer west and outer north of Melbourne, places like Point Cook, Werribee, Mulgrave, not in the west or the north, but in the southeast. That is looking like an interesting competition with people lining up to try to defeat Dan Andrews in his own seat. Never forget that nobody was really paying attention to Fowler when Di Lee was running, but that was one of the greatest upsets of this year's federal election, the fact that Di Lee, a right-leaning independent, knocked off Christina Keneally in an ultra-safe Labor seat. Now, if Matthew Guy can pick up a few seats in the country, if he can hold the seats that are at risk from Teals and all sorts of other characters, and if there are a few maroon independents, maybe we'll see a Matthew Guy minority government. I think it's a long shot, but stranger things have happened. So look, while Matthew Guy has not gone as far on policy issues as us true believers would have liked him to, it is a mistake to write off the Liberals, much as we might think that they have let the side down and so on. I think it still is winnable for them. And look, a lot can happen in a little while. Don't forget, Fred, as well, people don't really engage with state politics until a few weeks before they vote. So I think there'll still be a lot of people who are undecided heading into the last week of November.
Well, that's a lot of cause for optimism. Now, just before you go, I know this topic's very close to you because you were such an adamant and early emphatic voice against the lockdowns. There's a piece in The Age today from the New York Times, and it says in a kind of light-hearted style that the pandemic has increased what it calls social anxiety. And it's particularly in relation to teenagers. Now, weren't you warning about this 2 years ago? I mean, isn't it a bit late to be kind of trying to soften the overall effect of the lockdown at this late stage?
It's amazing to see people coming out of the woodwork now saying lockdowns were inappropriate, that they hurt people more than they saved lives, that border closures were wrong, that the closure of schools was especially wrong. And these were all things that Joe Hildebrand wrote a great piece about on news.com.au over the weekend based on the Shergold report, which came out very recently, which said all those things in very stark language. Look, the thing is, I refuse to believe that these consequences weren't obvious to people who really would have sat down and thought about what they were doing. I mean, closing schools for 2 years, locking people in their own homes for 23 hours a day, kicking people out of work, dividing families at state borders. Anybody with half a brain would have told you that this would have disastrous results economically, societally, psychologically, in terms of our culture, our soul, our spirit in this country. But not all of us, but most of the country, for the most part, or at least people in positions of power and influence, were hit with this wave of state-sponsored hypochondria. It's very cute now to rewrite history, but those of us who came out early against the lockdowns were rubbished and called granny killers and all sorts of other silly things. I take no pleasure in the fact that we were right, because even I underestimated how serious the results of that grand experiment in government authoritarianism was. And what I really I'm concerned about is that there doesn't seem to be enough people saying never again. And I, with some cultural and family background license, use those words very, very deliberately. Never, never, never again.